Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar of the Alliance for Water Efficiency, covering water efficiency and conservation state scorecards, 5-year update. We will be starting our webinar shortly. We're just gathering a number of our participants. Thank you for joining us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping while we start the webinar and get everyone to sign on. Just by way of information, the webinar will be 60 minutes in length with time for questions at the end. If you're hearing my voice, you have figured out the audio, but the audio is both through your telephone or your computer microphone and speakers. You have 2 options for doing that. And one of the things we need to make sure you understand is that the webinar phone line itself will be muted during the presentation because we are recording it. And during the recording, we always like to try to make sure that there aren't a lot of paper rustling and coffee cups and folks coming into your office to talk to you. We find that the recording is a lot cleaner if we can mute the participant lines, but that doesn't mean we don't want you to participate. We're very interested in having you ask questions and being involved in the discussion on the webinar. So what we suggest is that you type in the questions as they occur to you throughout the webinar, and then we will answer them at the end of the webinar. The speakers will be happy to answer your questions. So how do you type in your questions, you ask? In the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there will be a little orange rectangle with a white arrow. If you click that open, you'll see it opens a dialog box for the GoToWebinar program. And you can enter your questions in that dialog box. They will come to Liam, who is our webinar master, and he will read the questions in the order that they were received, directed to the speaker of your choice. So we're planning to address at least 10 minutes worth of questions, but we can also go over the 60-minute time if there are lots of questions that you'd like to have us answer. We'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. So what are the goals of this webinar today? We are very excited to present to you the results and findings of our 2017 state scorecard on water efficiency and conservation. And one of the things we'll do in the webinar is compare the results that we found in 2017 with the results we found in 2012. That was the first year that we did the scorecard. We'll also discuss a major addition to this particular report, which is the addition of climate change resiliency policies and scoring of those policies. And we'll hear from one state, Wisconsin, who participated with us on our project advisory committee. And we'll hear from Wisconsin on how the scorecard affects them. And then we'll offer you some ideas on how you might improve the state scores in your state if you are unhappy with how you've been ranked. So the speakers that we have include myself, Mary Ann Dickinson. I'm the CEO of the Alliance for Water Efficiency. We also have Chelsea Hawkins, who is a program planner with us at the Alliance, who's been managing the scorecard project for us. We have Adam Schemp, who's an attorney and director of the Western Water Program at the Environmental Law Institute. ELI has been a partner with us in these scorecards since we started them. And then we're very pleased to have Denise Schmidt, who is the Water Policy Advisor for the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. And she will provide us her state's perspective on the topics of water efficiency and conservation and our scoring of those efforts. So at this point, I think we're ready to launch into the webinar. Again, thank you to all of you for attending and being interested in this project. This is something we are particularly proud of at the Alliance for Water Efficiency. And we look forward to a lot of discussions with states in the upcoming months on how they have been scored. So in terms of the scorecard itself and the goal, why we started doing this, we'd been observing that scorecards had been sort of a regular feature in the energy efficiency program world. ACEEE has been doing state scorecards and then city scorecards for quite some time. The net effect of those scorecards have been to encourage some friendly competition among the states and among cities for who got the best score, who got the most improved score on a year-over-year basis. We know that it's provided a great template for measuring forward progressive progress in this particular area of energy efficiency. So since it has had such great success, we wanted desperately to provide the same encouragement for water efficiency policies. The difficulty is the energy efficiency scorecards are able to cover not just policies and regulations, but they're able to cover the status of what programs have been implemented, and so what has been achieved in terms of programmatic savings. There are big differences between the energy world and the water world in terms of the level of fragmentation. It's a lot easier to look at large municipal and investor-owned utilities because it's numbering in the small hundreds versus 53,000 community systems in the U.S. alone for delivering water. So given the large fragmentation in the water sector, compiling and scoring implementation of conservation programs was not something we were able to do given the funding constraints of this project. The project was funded by the Turner Foundation. We're very grateful for their support. But because of the extensive work that would be required to do implementation, our scorecards only focus on adopted legislative and regulatory policy. That way it provides a more level playing field for analyzing the 50 states. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Chelsea Hawkins, who was our project manager for the state scorecard, and she will walk us through how that scorecard came to be in 2017.
Thanks, Marianne. So first, just to provide a little bit of context regarding this project, this is a pursuit that AWE has been tracking for just under a decade, starting with the 2009 survey that was issued to all 50 states around critical topic areas and areas of particular interest for the water sector. That was an 11-question survey. There was a tremendous response to that, and so AWE, in partnership with ELI, formalized this project and conducted a follow-up survey in 2011, which resulted in the 2012 State Scorecard Report. And then this past year, we did a 5-year update to that, and there are some changes to the process that we use, some changes to the questions, which I'll touch on shortly, but we completed this 5-year update again with ELI and have released the 2017 State Scorecard Report. Throughout the process, one of the questions that has come up just from AWE members and others that we worked with is why look at state level laws. So I just wanted to share that we found a lot of value in this approach because state level laws provide insights into what we deem as critical topic areas for the water sector that can't really be obtained by a review of national laws. So one example is by looking at state level laws, we're able to ask questions such as what legal trends exist with relation to water loss control. That's just not something that we can navigate and learn enough about for purposes of this project by looking at any other kind of law. Next slide, please. So why a 5-year update? Two reasons from our perspective. The first is that a 5-year time frame is sufficient to realize change, good or bad, changes in laws. And the second reason is that part of this, a primary goal of this project, as Marianne touched on a little bit, is to create some healthy competition among states to motivate them and also provide guidance and feedback as to how laws can be improved or updated. And so we didn't want to go for too many years without revisiting this and asking these important questions again. And we really want to entice change and help change happen. Along with that, for the 2017, I'll mention it here. Thanks. Along with this, for the 2017 update, we also have expanded the resource offerings. And so we're creating and have already created some state-specific resources that really help states dig in beyond what's in the scorecard itself to figure out how exactly they can implement change, what areas they might want to start with, where they rank among all of the other states, all of these kinds of things that are available in their report, but we just tried to narrow it in for everybody who's interested in seeing their state scores improve. Next. So a few changes in the survey and the report. Question topics from 2012 to 2017 were generally the same. But one thing to note is that the 2017 survey that was used to gather all of this information was significantly expanded. So for example, question 8 in the 2017 report was on water loss control. That question also existed in the 2012 report and read as, does the state have any regulations or policies for water utilities regarding water loss in the distribution system? We asked a comparable question in the 2017 report, but went beyond that and also asked questions that touched on the application of the law, whether there were acceptable leakage standards, if there were audit requirements, if there were leak detection and or leak correction requirements, all of those kinds of things, to build a fuller picture of exactly what is going on in every state on water loss and several other critical topic areas. In addition, this report also began engaging on climate change resiliency issues. And so we had a much shorter survey that we used to try and figure out not only what plans exist at the state level and what states are doing and how they're preparing for impacts to climate change, but then specifically within that, what the implications are for the water sector within each state. And I would note that the climate change resiliency piece also issued a letter grade, a numeric score and an associated letter grade, but that is distinct from the actual state scorecard grade for efficiency and conservation. And then some quick notes about grading. Because we had many more questions, there were many more points available. However, the project team worked very, very hard to make sure that the scale used for 2017 for assigning letter grades was weighted in such a way that it was fairly comparable to that which was used in the 2012 report. So it's not an apples to apples comparison, but it is very, very close, and we have a lot of confidence that the grades that have been assigned are, fair and representative of what's going on within the state. As Marianne mentioned, this was not a project that covered implementation, only those laws that are really, on the books. And again, I think Marianne also noted that points were awarded, only for enforceable laws that were in place. And that was sort of a line that we drew to level the playing field as we reviewed all of the information we were getting. And with that, I will turn it over to Adam to talk more about the findings.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. So I'll talk first about the conservation and efficiency scores, and then I'll get into the resiliency scores. So with regard to conservation and efficiency, in 2017, we had 2 states that received an A grade of some form. Actually, both were A minuses, California and Texas. We had 17 states that received a B grade of some form, 14 states that received a C grade and of some form, and 17 states that received a D grade of some form. The average number of points earned among the states was 19, which equates to a C. Next slide, please. So the water conservation efficiency scores are reflected geographically here. The darker the shade of blue, the higher the grade. It is quite the patchwork, but the West Coast and Southwest have done rather well, while much of the Midwest and breadbasket area have notable room for improvement. It is worth noting, however, that although I may be getting a little ahead of myself, that several of the Midwest breadbasket states improved on their grades from 2012. So there is work being done there, and I don't want to overshadow that. Next slide. Comparing the 2017 grades to the 2012 ones in full now, the conservation and efficiency grades for 27 states went up, while those grades went down for only 6 states. As Chelsea just mentioned, the expanded scope of the 2017 survey makes this comparison not quite apples to apples, but we tried hard to keep that weighting for the different questions comparable, and both in terms of individual questions, but also the subsections within them. And really, the reason why we expanded out these questions was to get just have more transparency in terms of how we were grading, particularly when people are responding to the survey, so that they know what we're giving points for, what particular bits of information we're looking for in order to give points. But again, trying to keep it as close as possible to the rough scale that we used before, even though the total points almost doubled. So broadly speaking, oh, sorry, I can talk from here, that's fine. Broadly speaking, more states achieved an A or B grade in 2017 than they did in 2012. The number of C grades dropped from 18 to 14, and the number of D grades dropped from 19 to 17. Thus, there have been developments in water conservation and efficiency laws at all of those different levels, from states that are quite experienced with it to those who have very little on the books to date. Most of the grade changes have only been one step, sort of like a C plus to a B minus or a B to a B plus. But there have been some notable developments between 2012 and 2017 at all of these different grade levels. One example of that is Hawaii, which moved an entire letter grade from D to a C, largely because of its robust new law regarding water loss in utility distribution systems. Minnesota is another example of one more in that sort of middle range, where it went from a C plus to a B, in part because of new requirements in both drought planning and conservation planning. And while the developments in Texas and California, which are notable, wound up not being enough to move their respective grade, but they're really still pushing the envelope, setting the pace, and I really don't want that to be overlooked. Next slide. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to walk through each of the questions in the survey, which states have some of the most impressive laws and programs and what has changed over the last 5 years. But I do want to touch on a few broad findings that we had regarding some of those questions. And I really recommend for you to dive into the report if you get the opportunity. I particularly recommend the highlights section if you're looking for examples of good practices, good laws in each one of these cases for each one of these questions. Looking at questions 2 through 6 of the survey, all of which concern plumbing, fixture, and appliance standards, specifically whether the state had a more stringent standard than the federal government, we saw a few developments, but not a whole lot. And this could be, at least practically speaking, perhaps not necessarily politically, an easy way to gain quite a few points. Especially with all the WaterSense products on the market, but very few states have actually capitalized that in recent years and before. I will commend to you Colorado's 2014 statute, which prohibits the sale of plumbing fixtures that are not WaterSense listed, as an interesting recent example. And Illinois did something similar within the Great Lakes region of the state. Shifting to question 10. Despite all the complications from major droughts in the last 5 years, only 19 states require water suppliers to create and or implement drought plans. It stands to reason, though, that 4 of the 6 states that made strides in this area in the last 5 years were in the southeast of the U.S. Alabama, Arkansas, South Carolina, and Tennessee. Next slide, please. So question 12 of the survey asked whether states offered financial assistance other than drinking water state revolving funds to utilities, cities, or counties for water conservation programs. 1 point was given for using clean water state revolving funds for this purpose, but 4 points were given for any other funding. And we really didn't discriminate in terms of what that funding was. In this case, with this scorecard, basically you're having to make some calls as to where we try to draw lines and where we don't, and more or less we were trying to give states credit wherever they were giving some additional funding outside of those revolving funds towards that purpose of water conservation programs for utilities, cities, or counties. Unfortunately, that number, despite our best efforts of being fairly liberal in that regard, that number has actually decreased or declined from 2012 by about 4 states. So we'd really rather see this going up as opposed to down. And since sound water management requires continued substantial investment, it's a fairly disconcerting trend. There are good examples of such funding programs like those in Texas, Colorado, and Massachusetts. But again, for the sake of time, I'll direct you to the report for that information as well as examples from other states. Next slide, please. Finally, with regard to conservation and efficiency, the last 3 questions of the survey were interrelated insofar as metering connections enable volumetric billing, which in turn allows for conservation-oriented rate structures. 31 states have some form of requirement for metering connections. 11 states require volumetric billing, and 8 states require water suppliers to implement rate structures that send a conservation signal. Interestingly, though, only about half of the states that have a direct path to requiring conservation rate structures, i.e. there's some form of a requirement for metering connections, actually go the full length in requiring volumetric billing and then ultimately conservation rate structures. Next slide. Turning quickly to climate resiliency scores, 2 states received an A grade of some form, Oregon receiving the only A and California receiving an A-. 17 states received a B grade of some form, 9 states received a C grade of some form, and 22 states received a D grade of some form. The average number of points earned among the states was 7, which, like the conservation and efficiency portion, actually wound up equating to a C. Next slide. And by the way, there's much more detail about the grading scheme and our methodology and so forth. I know that Chelsea got into that a little bit, but the report really goes into depth in terms of exactly what we gave credit for in each one of these questions. Here again, like we did earlier, is a geographic representation of the resiliency scores. This will go just really quick. But okay, the darker the shade of green, the higher the grade. There really isn't much to be made from this map. It's quite a hodgepodge, other than the west coast of the U.S. is doing rather well. Next slide. To be clear, the word climate did not need to appear in the plan or law for it to receive credit. The key for us was whether the plan or law would mitigate the impacts on water resources, specifically, of the conditions that are associated with climate change, such as drought or less predictable weather patterns. Despite approaching this analysis so openly, only roughly half of the states had plans that received credit. Next slide. The state climate adaptation plans serve as guidance documents, basically. No state has created a legally enforceable obligation to actually implement the strategies that are in such a plan. Plan strategies range from vague recommendations to specific objectives and have concerned assessment of the problem, planning, outreach and education, operations, and infrastructure. Many plan recommendations are limited to effectively no regrets strategies and generally are advisable even in the absence of the threat of climate change. Only 6 states actually require that the climate adaptation plan be updated every 5 years or fewer, so quite a low number. A distinct question in the climate resiliency survey asked whether the state requires any climate change related actions of water or wastewater industries. And only 3 states received even partial credit for this question, none receiving full credit. And those 3 states were Louisiana, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island. Next slide. Looking at the climate resiliency and conservation and efficiency scores together, a surprising number of states have quite different scores for those 2 topics. Some states have high scores for resiliency, but low scores for conservation and efficiency. Examples of that include Alaska, Maine, Maryland, Montana, and Pennsylvania. And the inverse is true for some states. For example, Arizona, Georgia, Kentucky, Nevada, New Jersey, and Texas. A little over half the states that scored an A or B on one of those topics did so for the other. That list of 11 states with an A and or a B for both the climate resiliency and the efficiency and conservation scores are reflected here. I look forward to your questions at the end of this webinar, and I will now turn things over to Denise Schmidt with the Wisconsin PSC.
Thank you, Adam. Well, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak today from the breadbasket state that Adam was referring to. As Marianne and Chelsea mentioned, Wisconsin, and Adam mentioned, Wisconsin did pretty well. Much of what we've been doing is to implement what was in place in 2012. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our perspective. It's a unique one. Here in Wisconsin, in addition to regulating the state's technical and managerial capacity, which is largely what our DNR is responsible for, we regulate our utilities from a financial perspective. So states who are interested in conservation from not just a resource sustainability standpoint, but also a fiscal sustainability standpoint might be interested in looking what we have going on here in Wisconsin. Just like other public utility commissions around the country, our charge is to prevent discrimination in rates and service standards. It's a very customer-focused kind of mandate that we are operating under. Primarily, we look at the valuation of utilities, which translates into rates. And right there, we are interested in making sure that rates are just and reasonable, and not just from the standpoint of being as low as you can get, but rather that utilities have sufficient financial capacity to support the necessary infrastructure to deliver safe and reliable service. On the service standard end of the spectrum, we're looking at adequate customer service being provided regardless of where you are in the state, regardless of your utility ownership type. We want to help ensure that efficiencies are achieved. This is where things such as water loss and conservation come into play. And finally, we want to make sure that cost-effective innovations are adopted. Next slide, please. So the thing that's a little bit different about Wisconsin and compared to states with public utility commissions is that we are responsible for regulating all the water utilities in our state, not just those that are privately owned, but those that are owned by sanitary districts, townships, village, or cities. That excludes sewer utilities, water co-ops, and joint local water authorities. But it does translate into us overseeing the financial situation for the state's 578 drinking water utilities. And only one of those is an investor owned, by the way. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? What is our program comprised of? Well, we have, since roughly 2007, when our Conservation Efficiency Initiative really got a jump start, we've been integrating water conservation into each of these program areas. The setting water utility rates is kind of our bread and butter. Every water utility rate in this state is approved by the Commission. We ensure compliance and establish rules and practices. So we are responsible for suggesting, as approved by the state legislature, administrative codes, and making sure that state statute is enforced from the drinking water perspective. We review construction applications, and that's where we look at, is infrastructure being right-sized? Is conservation efficiency being integrated and considered in that regard? Promoting utility effectiveness and viability, of course, involves water conservation efficiency. And then finally, investigating customer complaints. When you can deliver affordable solutions through conservation efficiency to a customer, it really helps an overall utility program. Next slide, please. So not only are we one of these breadbasket states, we are a Great Lakes state. And so why would a Great Lakes state with an abundant source of supply in most of the state care about conservation? Well, despite this abundant supply, we do have local and regional constraints, particularly in those areas outside the Great Lakes region, outside the Great Lakes watershed. There's increasing public interest. Customers really want to see that their water utility is doing something to be preserving resources and running as efficiently and effectively as possible. The Great Lakes Compact regulates new and increased withdrawals inside that Great Lakes basin that you see there. And this means that not just conservation requirements are in place for the basin area, but it translates to the state requiring a statewide conservation program. So that's really had some great results in our state, and that now we have a better handle on how folks are using water in this state. And then finally, and what really resonates with the Public Service Commission is conservation can be a significant tool for addressing all the challenges utilities are facing. Next slide, please. So the challenges in Wisconsin are those that are seen across the country. We've got declining sales trends. So with a high fixed cost industry, such as that water utility industry, which is a vertically integrated one, this can be a real challenge to recover those fixed costs. Next slide, please. And speaking of scorecards, I'm sure we all seen this one. And not very many states have received great grades for drinking water infrastructure. Well, Wisconsin's among those where there is a need for significant investment. The infrastructure era, replacement and refurbishment era is indeed upon us. And somehow utilities have to do that in that era of declining sales revenue. Next slide, please. We are finding new things we need to be concerned about, and that drinking water utilities are responsible for taking care of. An example would be revisions to the federal lead and copper rule and health advisories on contaminants that are not currently regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, but may at some point in the future. So this is a challenge for utilities. Next slide. So given these challenges as a backdrop to what our utilities are facing, we've worked in Wisconsin to make conservation efficiency work for our state in a specific manner. And here are some of the following ways that translate into our water conservation efficiency initiative. As Adam mentioned, we're one of those states where all water sales are based on metered amounts. We at the Commission help utilities that so desire develop a conservation rate, and we make sure that that is done in that just and reasonable manner, and that customers are treated fairly. We review and approve utilities' water conservation programs, and in that regard, we will work with a utility to help them find ways to adopt customer incentive and rebate programs. We do have water loss control standards in this state. I'll touch on those a little bit in a couple slides later. And finally, we are encouraging integration of conservation and efficiency into utilities' capital planning. That's that bit where we are approving construction projects. The largest component of a utility's rates is that associated with its infrastructure. So this is an important part of our program. Next slide, please. So I mentioned our bread and butter is doing rates here at the PSC, where Minnesota has the drought planning and conservation planning. One of our key components of our program is this development of rates. All of our utilities rates are developed in a transparent process where folks can comment via our website, and the rate structures such as the one you see there on the right, those are all posted on our website and are indicated as tariffs. So anybody wishing to look at our tariffs in our state can go right to our website and see all 578 utility designs. This is an example to the right there of one of our water utility rates. Each one of our rates has two fixed charge components. That would be that monthly service charge up there, that's a customer charge. There's also a public fire protection charge, which is in a separate tariff. And then every single utility rate has a volume component. So the example you see there is one with an inclining block rate structure. Next slide, please. So that's just an example there where our tariffs are exhibited on our website under the, and that's where you would find our rates and service standards. Next slide, please. So in terms of approving rebate programs, we generally, there are a couple things that we are looking at. In Wisconsin, we have a forward-looking test year, and we look at demand suppression that results from some of these conservation and rebate programs. As I mentioned before, we have very customer-facing rules and regulations at the PSC, and because utility conservation programs enhance customer service, we're very interested in trying to encourage utilities to adopt them. We are one of the states where rebate and incentive programs are financed through rates, and Commission's approval of the rebate programs is for fixtures that are WaterSense certified. We really love that third-party certification because we know that when a utility is putting themselves out there and adopting a program like this that ratepayers are paying for, that the fixtures are going to work and achieve objectives. Next slide, please. So our water loss control requirements are something that a lot of states look to us on. We've required utilities report on their water loss and their non-revenue water for several decades now. They've been required to conduct an annual water audit that's consistent with the M36 methodology. The utilities are to maintain and verify the accuracy of their customer and production meters. If you'll recall, I mentioned that all of our rates and charges and what a customer's bill is based on is a metered volumetric amount. Utilities are to identify and repair leaks in their distribution systems to the extent that it's reasonable. They are to control water usage from hydrants, and they are to maintain records of their water pumped and water sales. So throughout time, they need to track how they're doing in this regard. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of our administrative code. There are the service standards for water public utility service. You'll see there that is where you would find our customer meter and accuracy requirements and meter testing. Of course, I think these details are going to be included in the scorecard where folks can find some of the details on our program. Next slide, please. Education and outreach is a big part of our program at the PSC. As you can imagine, with 578 utilities, we can't visit everyone every year, but we are really trying to deliver many more resources via our website. Water loss training is one of them that AWE was gracious enough to allow us to host a workshop, and we've got a great videotape of those workshops on our website, thanks to AWE. Their Environmental Finance Center network also has a number of great resources on water loss control. We're really trying to meet utilities where they are. It seems increasingly that learning at the desk at the time that's convenient to operators and clerks who are very busy running a water utility, but this is really the way to deliver better understanding what it takes to run an efficient system and to provide customer service. Next slide, please. So finally, I just want to speak a little bit about the 2012 scorecard before I talk about the 2017 scorecard. I think that in 2012, so our conservation efficiency initiative had been around for roughly 5 years by that point. So we're still looking for ways to kind of implement some new code and statutes that were on the book. And I think the 2012 scorecard was particularly helpful to a person like me. So, full disclosure, somebody mentioned the competitive nature of a scorecard. I'm a hockey mom, so I will fully admit to having a competitive streak. And I do think that that does incentivize change. So when looking at the 2017 scorecard, where we were essentially holding steady, what we've been working on is really implementation of what's been on the books and trying to right-size things for Wisconsin. I think that the 2017 scorecard affirms our areas of strength, and we're on the right track. We're looking for the low-hanging fruit and really kind of grabbing that and maybe looking for the next steps we can take. I'm interested I'm very excited about the new resource offerings in the scorecard and the rich detail that'll be provided there, because I think that'll really help us identify new conservation efficiency ideas, that would help us enhance our existing program components. And finally, I think looking at how other states have approached this, particularly our cohort states that have generally abundant supply, but not always in a temporal or locational area that is immediately obvious, that identifying ways to benchmark our results is really going to help us move forward in our program. So that's why I'm excited that the 2017 scorecard is out and was thrilled to be a participant. So that's all I have.
Thank you very much, Denise. I think what we want to do now to finish up presentation of the scorecard is to talk with you about ways that you might improve your state score should you wish to do so. And so we've come up with a couple of steps that we wanted to walk through. The first thing to do is to identify why your state scores the way it does. What are the areas where you scored particularly lowly in any one of those questions? And the report itself offers a lot of explanatory detail as to how the scoring was done for each of the different questions. So most of what you would need to find out will be contained in the scorecard report itself. And so if you compare then, step number 2, match up the areas where you had low scores with what your states might need, what you might be wanting to face in terms of solutions for your water resource sustainability concerns. Maybe some of the strategies that were outlined in some of the questions where other states scored highly would benefit you. So as an example, if you really need to bring down statewide water demand, considering adopting plumbing standards that are stricter than the federal law has benefited 4 states so far, California, Texas, Georgia, and Colorado. So maybe that's an item that you could consider adopting in your state. So that's an example of that kind of strategy. So where it's appropriate, where you've decided that this is an area where improvement in that particular question issue area would help you, the next step is to develop legislative or regulatory amendments to your existing statutes or code of regulations that would have similar provisions to those states who scored highly in those areas. And a step 4 is to check with us because we might have some language that can help you with that, particularly with respect to the plumbing standards laws. We have language that we have worked with other states on in getting that adopted. So we're happy to share that with you. We can also help share language from states that have scored really well in that particular area that you can perhaps take a look at and customize for your needs. Step 5 is the action side of this, finding the right person to carry your mission, finding a legislative or regulatory advocate who can champion the changes that you want to make to your state laws or your state regulations. And as state folks know, they can't often initiate some of these changes themselves as a state introduced initiative. Sometimes it takes it being introduced from one of the other advocates on the outside, either a legislator who's particularly concerned about water resource issues or another part of the regulatory structure within the state that could be helping to champion that. And then finally, adoption doesn't occur without stakeholder support. And so the last step is making sure that you've rallied all of the people in the state that you know would come and support you in a hearing. None of these changes likely occur without some form of due public process. So hearings are a great opportunity to bring out a considerable number of stakeholders within the plumbing community, the irrigation community, environmental stakeholders, and most importantly, water utilities who are able to come and support changes that might be made at the state level to say, yes, this impacts us, but yes, we support it because we think it's a good idea. So having that kind of stakeholder support on the public record really helps get that passed. But just a couple of last comments. Don't give up. It sometimes takes a couple of tries to get this through. Ask Colorado. They had to do it a couple of times to get the legislature to finally adopt the law. Sometimes the first year it goes down, but people are thinking about it, and then the next year everybody is ready. They have collected the stakeholders, they have vetted the language a little better and gotten it adopted. So our next scorecard revision is in 2022, so you have a fair amount of time to make some of this happen, and we're happy at the Alliance for Water Efficiency to work with you on some of those positive changes. So at this point, I want to thank our speakers, Chelsea, Adam, and Denise, for being part of this webinar. And I think we're at the point now where we can take your questions. While we're assembling your questions, before I turn it over to Liam to read what questions we've gotten, we just want to let you know that we'll be posting a PDF of this presentation and a link for the recorded webinar. We'll be posting both of those on our AWE website. They'll be available in a few days. Those of you who have registered for the webinar will also get it automatically in an email. And if you have additional questions that you've thought of after the webinar, email Chelsea here at we've given you her address. And then stay tuned for our next webinar, which will be on cooling technology research and innovations. And we are scheduling that probably for sometime in late May. We don't have the date yet, but we will have it soon. So watch for us and our emails coming out that will give you information about that registration. So at this point, Liam, could you let us know what questions we might have?
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. We have quite a few, so I'll get right to it. The first question is about the premise that a state can't collect water conservation data. They bring up the example of Minnesota doing it now across the state, and they're asking if you think it might be possible in the next edition of the scorecard to factor that in. I'm not sure who exactly would be the best person to answer that, but.
So is that factoring in water conservation program information? I think I'm not quite understanding the question.
Premise that a state can't collect water conservation data. So maybe they're referring to implementation or
okay.
The effectiveness of programs.
So,
Denise, I'll just chime in. I'm a little puzzled too, but I think we are able to, in that all of our utilities file annually an annual report with us that has all their financial operating data included. So we're kind of set up to take that information in. I'm just not sure. I don't know if that was a factor or that wasn't one of the questions, but it's a fair point. Does a state have the ability to collect it?
Okay.
This is Adam. Yeah. One of the things that I'll throw in there real quickly is just that dividing line that we've unfortunately had to strike or take with regard to implementation versus requirements. And it sounds like that's something that would fall more on the implementation side unless there was a requirement that the utilities or some other entity was actually collecting and managing that information, which if in that case, it's certainly something that we could cover. But if it's just who is doing it as opposed to a requirement to do it, that becomes a lot harder for us to not only collect that information, but then standardize it in terms of scoring.
And just as a final comment to that, we know that many states do require conservation program reporting of some kind, either through their planning requirements or through separate requirements like in California for regular monthly reporting. But that isn't something that we had added as a question as this particular round, and it's something we'll look at if we can easily compile the data for the next round. As Adam mentioned, it's because of the wide range of the way it's occurring. We'll have to see whether that's something we can add in 2012.
2022.
Okay, well, speaking of 2012, that brings us to our next question. It seems that when comparing 2012 to 2017, a change in score either way could be due to a different person filling out the survey. Do you believe this to be significant?
It could in terms of the answers, but we also vet all of the answers. The majority of the questions particularly on the, for purposes of comparison, we were only able to do that for the conservation efficiency portion, not the resiliency portion, because we didn't have a resiliency survey before. But for conservation and efficiency, the majority of the questions are ones that we can go back into the regulations and the statutes and actually find the language in the law that would support that statement. And so we double check everything. There are a handful of questions towards the end that get a little bit more difficult in terms of funding, for example, to vet. And we try to do the best that we can to ensure that those programs are in existence. They're still providing funds, and they're providing funds for that purpose. But in that instance, we are relying a little bit more on who's answering the question to have known about the program and or the survey to have known about the program and to have answered completely. That being said, we also try to talk to as many people as we can to get as robust of an answer for each one of the states. So it's not just necessarily a single person that's always answering these questions. I don't know if Chelsea, you had anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, moving along. How are states that received an A or B grade being motivated to continue their efforts? Or if they received an A-, how do you motivate them to get an A+?
This is Adam again.
That's a really good question. Yeah. Go ahead.
In terms of continuing to push forward, I would say that we have skewed it. We don't want this to necessarily remain static, and in that technology improves, abilities improve to do some of this stuff. And I don't think the scoring necessarily needs to stay exactly the way it was in 2012. I think that particularly on the high end, there's the opportunity to continue to push people by continuing to open up new possibilities as things become available, and that gets incorporated into the entirety of what someone could score. So we hope that as we continue to look at new developments within these scorecards, both in terms of the questions that we ask and the way in which we grade, that while we're keeping things as relatively consistent as we can, we're not completely shutting ourselves off to new developments. In terms of why states would care to get a higher grade, I hope there are more hockey moms out there, that people that are willing to are just interested in trying to push forward. And the biggest thing is, we talk about grades, but the reality is trying to protect your water supplies or ensure that you're able to meet the demands that you have in front of you going forward. And that's where we hope that those areas, particularly those that are really facing those problems or foresee them down the line, that they are taking this seriously and trying to figure out ways to do it better.
And just to add a little bit to what Adam just said, under the category of friendly rivalry, you should know that the state of Texas has duly noted that they are only 1 point behind California. And if I can predict in the future some progress there, I will, because I think Texas is motivated to get on top. And so even though Texas is an A- state, they are still looking at improving their score going forward. So I think there's still going to be opportunity for that, plus adding the additional areas that Adam discussed.
And California has some things brewing that very much look like they are going to improve their score in 2022.
Right.
Okay. Question about how did you measure the ability or willingness or funding to actually enforce the laws and regulations?
Can't, unfortunately. It really is just black letter of the law, because unfortunately don't have the funding in this project to go deeper again into implementation, to know what is really being done with the law. And the reality of that is that sometimes there are some phenomenal things going on that we can't capture because we have to draw a line in the sand somewhere and say this is what gets a grade and this is what doesn't get a grade. There also are instances where there may be some really good things on the books that aren't being implemented and aren't being enforced, and those states may be getting a higher grade than practically they deserve, but it's the reality of, what we're working with when you're trying to standardize across 50 states.
Across 50 states,
stated?
and across 53,000 water systems. So it's not just at the state level, the 50 states. It's the enforcement layers down below them that makes this especially problematic.
Okay, I know you guys said the scorecard doesn't really focus much on implementation, but the question is, who should be responsible for implementation of water efficiency programs? Water utilities, municipalities, regulatory bodies, or a government agency?
Well, it's probably a combination of all of them. Typically, water utilities and municipalities are the delivery mechanisms of the conservation programs to the end-use customer. Conservation is an end-use program, so it's usually delivered by those that are serving water to those customers. But it's often motivated and driven by state and regional regulatory policies. So it's a combination of all of that. What the scorecard measures is the planning component of it, as well as the direction to comply with various laws and policies that require action on the part of the water utility itself. So it's a combination, I think, of all of them.
And I'll just add to that, as a state regulator, given the location-specific challenges for each utility, and with 578 of them, it really is a partnership. We really do need to rely on the utilities to deliver the product. But by the same token, we like to be, we need to make sure that they're doing it correctly and in a way that's non-discriminatory, but also serving as a resource to them. So that's where that kind of partnership element comes in.
Okay, moving along. Did you assess at all water efficiency use in industry, or how efficient is the process carried out by private enterprises?
Again, that's an implementation question. Yeah, that's an implementation question. So to the extent that, for example, the state law requires that point of sale of plumbing and appliances, plumbing fixtures and appliances be at a certain efficiency level, that is requiring that occur at the retail level. So there are requirements and laws where it is not just implemented by the water utility, but it's actually implemented by whoever is affected by a code or by a regulation like that. So it's not just a utility compliance issue, it's also those who fall under that jurisdiction.
And we gave more credit in some of these questions for the breadth of application of those requirements. So, for example, is it something that's done more at the point of sale, or is the universal requirement as opposed to something that might be relevant for a particular size or scale of development or a particular type of user, et cetera. We also distinguish, and this wasn't necessarily the question, but just to clarify, also with that scoping, were the requirements applying to private as well as public utilities, and different credit was given if it was for both as opposed to just one.
Okay, can you talk about how you manage states that have multiple agencies that might carry out different roles that intersect on the subject matter? Is it possible to find out which agencies responded for any given state?
Didn't really make much difference in the scoring. Our very first question was who has a role in the state for this, and so that's for each one of the states we have the answer that was provided, and we tried to track down, and again Chelsea can talk more to this, the individuals that might have something to say on this front. But in terms of the scores themselves, we didn't really care where it came from as opposed to the requirement being on the book somewhere.
And typically in many states, there were multiple agencies that had different pieces of the questions that were asked. So it never was just one entity that covered every single question.
Yeah, and this is Chelsea. Just to add to that, throughout the survey process, we were, I think, very proactive about reaching out to, staff in all of the different agencies to get all of those different pieces of information and try to align things so that nothing was left out.
Okay, just a couple more questions here. If you wanted to see states standardize on M36 water loss, would you consider collecting and sharing that data on a national basis?
Ooh, we would be very interested in doing that. There's a considerable amount of national interest in that kind of information, and various partners of ours, Kavanaugh Associates was very active with us in helping us assemble the water loss and non-revenue water information. So we thank them for that, and we know that's something that they are tracking nationally. So, that's something we would love to add to the 2022 scorecard. We hope that by the time we get to that point 5 years from now, there will be much more uptake and compliance with M36 protocol. So yes, we'd be very interested in that.
Okay. So next question, what would it take to include regulations and not just actual legislation?
We do. Anything that is a statute or anything that's a regulation, we include that. We do not cover guidance and other documentation along those lines, and that was a clear line that we had to draw. But if it was promulgated as a regulation or it was enacted as a piece of legislation, we include it, we consider it.
Okay, that is all we have. Several folks did ask where they can obtain the full report. I assume we'll announce that before we sign off, but
that's a good question. Yes, we are posting it today on the Alliance for Water Efficiency webpage. If you just go to Alliance for Water Efficiency, all one word, .org, after this webinar, it will be the top story on our homepage. You can click in and it'll give you all kinds of information about the scorecard, including a PDF of the executive summary as well as the full report itself. So it's all being released today. So we'd be happy to share that with you.
It looks like we just had one more question come in. They're wondering if AWWA standards would be included, I'm assuming, amongst regulations.
Well, here's an interesting question. The American Water Works Association, AWWA, has a standard called the G480 Water Conservation Standard. It's a standard geared toward compliance by water utilities to a series of best practices in water conservation and efficiency programming. And the Alliance for Water Efficiency has a separate process where we are willing to help utilities benchmark their own activities to that standard and to rate them as to how well they meet that. That has not been part of the state scorecard because we view that as an implementation function, but it's one that we care very deeply about. So elsewhere on the Alliance website, you will find information on the G480 standard, what it is, and how utilities can comply with it. We are hoping to develop a long list of utilities that are complying with the standard as a way to benchmark their excellent track record in that regard. So that is something we will continue to look at. In terms of AWWA, other standards like water quality standards, that's not been part of our work, and there is no other water efficiency requirement that I'm aware of through AWWA other than the water loss issues in M36 that we discussed earlier. So those questions were tracked in the scorecard in terms of what the water loss policies were in the individual states, and it's a big area of concern. We want to make sure the states are complying with the AWWA M36 methodology and getting away from the unaccounted for water percentages that historically have been put in state legislation. We'd like to see, you know, a much deeper approach to reducing non-revenue water that follows that M36 methodology from AWWA. So those are really the two areas that we have been focusing on with respect to separate certification of utility performance, as well as the water loss requirements in M36, which we did report on in the scorecard.
All right,
So,
well, that's all we have for questions.
Okay, well, I am very grateful to all of you for having participated in this webinar with us. We are, again, offering webinars throughout 2018. We'll be featuring another one next month, so watch for information about it. And check out the state scorecard. We're very happy you were part of the webinar. We'd love to have your comments on the scorecard. Give us your feedback and let us know if you'd like help in improving your state score. So thank you to Chelsea Hawkins, Adam Schemp, and Denise Schmidt for their great presentations on this webinar. And thank you for participating.